The air around the cottage carried the scent of wet grass and old roses. Helen leaned on the wooden railing of the porch, watching the drizzle scatter silver drops across the overgrown garden. Beyond the hedges, the hills rolled in soft shades of green and gray, dissolving into the mist. The house had stood there for decades, her father's once, then hers. A summer place meant for quiet repairs, not for sheltering untold thoughts. She heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. The old Ford stopped by the gate. James stepped out, taller than she remembered, his jacket dark with rain. He raised a hand in greeting, a little uncertain. Helen smiled faintly, a polite, distant motion that did not reach her eyes. "Traffic?" she asked as he climbed the steps. "Bit of it near Oxford. The rain doesn't help." He shook his head and laughed softly, the way he used to when he visited with her daughter Lily. But Lily wasn't coming this time. She had gone abroad for work, leaving James with weeks of unfilled time and Helen with a half-empty house. They stood there for a moment, awkward but familiar. "Come in before you freeze," she said finally. Inside, the room smelled of cedar and tea. James carried his bag upstairs while Helen filled the kettle. She told herself it was only kindness, only company. He was family, nothing else. Over dinner, simple pasta, a bottle of white wine, they spoke of ordinary things. London, work, the price of petrol, how Lily was settling in Spain. Helen noticed the fatigue in his voice, the restless edge under his calm. He asked her about the garden, about the books she was reading. It felt like a rehearsal for comfort, two people trying to remember how conversation worked. When thunder rolled later that night, Helen went to check the windows. She found James standing by the back door, watching the rain pour over the steps. The light from the kitchen lamp softened his face, making him look younger. "Storm's not letting up," he said. "No," she murmured. "It never does when you want it to." They shared a quiet smile. Then silence. Only the hum of the fridge and the rain's insistent tapping filled the air. Helen excused herself and went to bed. But sleep was a distant visitor. She lay awake listening to the wind rattle the gutters, remembering the years when the house was full. Her husband alive, Lily still a child. The loneliness now had a sound, like water dripping in the dark. She thought of James down the hall, of how strange it was to have another heartbeat under the same roof again. She told herself it meant nothing, just habit, the human wish not to be alone. The next morning broke clear and bright, the world washed clean. Helen was already outside pruning roses when James came out with 2 mugs of coffee. "You're up early," he said. "I don't sleep well in storms." He handed her a mug. "Then coffee's in order." She accepted it, their fingers brushing briefly. The touch was small, accidental, but it left an echo. She felt it linger through the next few minutes, through the sound of birds and the smell of wet earth. They worked side by side, trimming the garden, repairing the old fence. It became a rhythm, tools passing between them, small jokes, shared silence. Helen noticed how easily laughter returned when she didn't expect it. At lunch, they ate in the shade of the apple tree. Bees circled lazily above. James told her about his job, how the office felt emptier since Lily left, how he had started painting again in the evenings. Helen listened, surprised at how much she wanted to know every detail. "You sound happier here," she said. He nodded. "I think I just needed quiet." "You know." "I know." Their eyes met. The moment stretched, full of something unsaid. Helen looked away, pretending to check her phone. That evening they walked down to the lake. The path was muddy, lined with foxglove and nettles. Helen wore her old raincoat. James carried a lantern. The water shimmered under a pale sky. "This place hasn't changed," he said. "It rarely does," she replied. "Maybe that's why I come back." They stood by the shore, watching the ripples catch the light. James skipped a stone across the surface. It bounced 3 times before sinking. "I used to do that with Lily," he said softly. "She told me," Helen replied, her voice careful. "She said you were the only one who could make her laugh when exams went wrong." He smiled. She got that from you. Helen wanted to protest, to tell him he was wrong. But the warmth in his tone stopped her. She looked out at the lake instead, feeling a strange ache, something between pride and regret. When they walked back, dusk had settled. Fireflies blinked near the hedge, the smell of damp leaves thick in the air. Helen felt the pull of memory again. How fleeting peace could be, how fragile the heart when it begins to remember itself. Back at the cottage, James lit a small fire in the hearth. The crackle filled the silence. Helen poured tea, and they sat opposite each other, the glow painting their faces in gold and shadow. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" he asked. "Sometimes. But it's part of me. Every room holds something I can't quite let go of." He nodded slowly. "I get that. I think I came here because I needed to remember who I was before everything got complicated." Helen looked at him then, really looked. The tiredness, the kindness, the quiet searching. She understood. Maybe too well. Outside, the rain began again, soft and rhythmic. She whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe we both did." The storm passed in the night, leaving the sky a hard, polished blue. Sunlight streamed through the curtains when Helen woke. The scent of wood smoke still lingered from the fire. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she heard footsteps in the kitchen, the scrape of a chair. James making breakfast. She stayed in bed a while longer, listening. The house had not sounded like this in years. It was not just noise. It was presence, another rhythm of life brushing against her own. When she finally came downstairs, he had already set the table. Eggs, toast, a jar of homemade jam that had been in her pantry for months. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She hesitated. "You didn't have to do all this." He shrugged, smiling. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd try being useful." Helen sat down, trying not to show how the simple gesture moved her. "You've already earned your place here by fixing that fence yesterday." He laughed. "Then I'll fix the gutter today. It's barely hanging on." "Please do. I've been ignoring it for years." They ate quietly, the sound of birds outside filling the pauses. Helen noticed how natural it felt to share the small silence between bites, the way families do when words are no longer necessary. After breakfast, James went out to the shed for tools. Helen washed the dishes, her thoughts circling like the soapy water in the sink. She wondered how long he would stay. She wondered why the idea of him leaving already made her stomach tighten. Later, when she brought him lemonade, he was on the ladder, sleeves rolled up, sunlight catching in his hair. The rhythm of his hammering echoed against the wood. She stood for a moment before speaking. "You'll scare the neighbors with all this productivity," she said. He grinned down at her. "Do we have neighbors?" "Only Mrs. Fenton, and she's half deaf." "Perfect. No complaints then." She passed him the glass. He drank deeply, then wiped his hand before returning it. "You ever think of selling this place?" "Every winter," Helen said. "And every spring I change my mind." "Why?" She looked up at him. "Because it's the only place that still feels like mine." Something in her tone made him pause. The wind stirred the trees. For a heartbeat, they looked at each other without speaking, the air thick with something unspoken, recognition maybe, or shared exhaustion. Then he turned back to his work. "Then you should keep it," he said softly. By afternoon the sky turned hazy with heat. They took a walk down the lane, the gravel crunching underfoot. Helen carried a basket, planning to pick blackberries by the field. James followed with the calm patience of someone who had stopped rushing. They filled the basket slowly, fingers stained purple. Bees hummed lazily around them. "You used to come here with Lily, didn't you?" Helen asked. He nodded. She loved this field. Said the berries tasted better when stolen. Helen smiled at the memory. She got that from her father. They both laughed softly, and then the laughter faded into a thoughtful quiet. "She's doing well," James said after a while. "Sends photos every week. The new job seems good for her." "I know," Helen replied. "I'm proud of her." "Me too." Helen hesitated before asking, "Do you miss her?" James looked away toward the horizon. Every day, he said simply. But I'm glad she's finding her own life. Helen watched him, sensing the truth beneath his calm. She wanted to tell him that letting go is the hardest kindness, that she had learned that lesson too late. But the words stayed unspoken. Evening came early. The horizon glowed amber as they walked back, the basket heavy with berries. James carried it the last stretch. At the porch, Helen turned to him. "Thank you for helping today." He smiled. "I should be thanking you. I haven't felt this. Still in years." Still. He searched for the word. At peace, maybe. Helen looked at him then, truly looked, the steadiness in his eyes, the gentle curve of his smile. She felt a quiet pull, not of desire but of understanding, like two chords resonating in the same air. "Peace is rare," she said finally. "Hold on to it while you can." That night they made tea and sat outside on the steps. The stars were thin and pale, the kind you see only far from cities. Crickets sang in the grass. "Do you ever feel like you stopped halfway through a story?" James asked suddenly. Helen tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you make plans, build a life, and then one day you realize you've drifted into a different chapter you never meant to write." She thought for a moment. "Yes, many times." He looked at her. "What do you do then?" "You learn to keep reading," she said quietly. "Sometimes the ending changes when you least expect it." He nodded, absorbing her words. The night air grew colder. Helen pulled her shawl tighter. James stood to fetch another blanket, but she stopped him with a gesture. "It's fine. Sit." They sat in silence, watching the stars shift overhead. Somewhere an owl called. The sound was soft, haunting, familiar. Helen's mind wandered back to the years when her husband was alive, when laughter filled the garden. The ache was still there but gentler now, like a scar that no longer hurt when touched. He turned to James. "You know, I think you're right about chapters," she said. "Maybe this place isn't the end of mine after all." He smiled. "Then maybe it's a beginning for both of us." Helen didn't answer, but something inside her eased. For the first time in months she felt lightness. Not joy exactly, but something close to it. The next morning, she woke to find the kitchen already alive with sunlight and the smell of coffee. James had drawn a rough sketch of the garden on a piece of paper, marking where new flowers could go. "I was thinking we could plant some lavender here," he said, pointing. "It'll bring bees and keep the air sweet." Helen looked at the drawing, then at him. "You've planned more in a day than I've done all year. Maybe plans are easier when you don't have to make them alone." She met his gaze. There was no weight in it now, only quiet understanding. "Then let's plant it," she said. As the day stretched on, they worked together again, digging, planting, laughing at the stubborn roots that refused to move. The soil was warm, the air bright. For a while the world felt simple. Helen realized then that perhaps hope did not arrive like thunder or light. Perhaps it came slowly, in the rhythm of shared work, in the soft exchange of words, in the silence that no longer felt empty. By evening, lavender lined the fence, the scent drifting between them. When James packed away the tools, he looked at the garden and said, "It looks different already." Helen smiled. "So do we." The air had shifted. Autumn crept in at the edges of the garden, turning the leaves pale gold. Helen noticed it first in the mornings, the way mist pooled around the hedges, how her breath came out white. James was already in the kitchen when she came down, sleeves rolled, stirring porridge. The radio hummed softly, an old folk song about rain. "Sleep?" she asked. "Barely," he said with a grin. "The roof sings louder than it used to." Helen smiled. "That's not singing. That's leaking." They laughed. It was a familiar rhythm now. Quiet mornings, shared chores, long silences that no longer needed filling. But beneath it, something trembled, fragile and unspoken. The phone rang. Helen froze. James reached for it, but she stopped him with a glance and picked up herself. "Lily." Her daughter's voice came bright and distant through static. "Mum." Finally. "I've been trying for days." The line kept cutting. Helen's heart fluttered. I'm here, love. How's Spain? They spoke lightly, work, weather, food. Lily laughed about her small apartment and the heat. But then, inevitably, and how's James? He said he might stop by the cottage while I'm away. Helen's eyes met his. He stood still, waiting. He's here, Helen said carefully. Helping with the garden. Oh, that's wonderful, Lily said, relief in her tone. You two never got much time to talk, you know? Maybe it's good for both of you. Helen swallowed. Yes, she said. It's been good. The call ended too soon, leaving a silence that hummed louder than the wind outside. James turned to her. She sounds happy. She does, Helen replied, but her voice wavered. She turned away to pour tea. Neither of them mentioned how heavy the air had become. That afternoon, a knock echoed at the front door. Helen frowned. Visitors were rare. On the porch stood Mrs. Fenton, the half-deaf neighbor. Her hat tilted and her eyes sharp despite her years. Didn't know you had company, Helen, she said cheerfully, glancing past her shoulder. Saw the smoke from your chimney every day this week. Thought I'd check you hadn't taken ill. Helen forced a smile. I'm fine, Mrs. Fenton. Just keeping busy. The old woman's gaze drifted toward James, who appeared behind Helen with a polite nod. Mrs. Fenton said knowingly. Helping hand, is he? Helen hesitated. James extended his hand. James, ma'am. Family friend. Family friend, Mrs. Fenton repeated, her tone unreadable. Well, it's good you've got company. A woman alone in a house like this. People start talking, you know. Helen felt heat rise in her cheeks. I don't pay much mind to talk. Mrs. Fenton smiled thinly. Best not to. Still, I'd watch the curtains if I were you. When the neighbor finally left, the silence that followed was sharp. James leaned against the door. Do people really gossip that much here? Helen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Only when they have nothing better to do. He looked at her, concern softening his voice. We've done nothing wrong. She nodded but didn't answer. Wrong or not, she knew how stories could twist, how a few kind gestures could become scandal in the mouths of the bored. That night, Helen sat by the fire long after James went upstairs. The flames flickered against the window glass, casting her reflection, older, tired, uncertain. She thought about Mrs. Fenton's words, about Lily's bright voice across the sea. For years she had lived quietly, never giving anyone reason to whisper. But peace she was learning was fragile. Days passed. They tried to return to routine, fixing shutters, painting the shed, baking bread. Yet a shadow had crept into the rhythm, subtle but persistent. One evening, James found Helen on the porch, staring into the dark garden. You've gone quiet, he said gently. She smiled faintly. I keep thinking how easily things break. Even words. James sat beside her. I can go if you want me to. She turned sharply. No, that's not what I meant. I just don't want to make life harder for you. Helen looked at him, really looked, the worry in his eyes, the kindness that had no angle, no expectation. You make it better, she said softly. They sat there until the stars came out, the night air thick with unspoken promises neither dared name. The weather turned again. Wind rattled the eaves, and yellow leaves chased each other down the lane. Helen had always loved this shift in seasons, the hush before winter, but now it made her uneasy. Every creak of the gate felt like a watcher's footstep. She told herself it was foolish, that Mrs. Fenton's words were just habit, but still she found herself drawing the curtains earlier than before. James noticed. You're closing out the world, he said one evening as she pinned the latch. Maybe just the noise of it, she replied. He didn't press. Instead, he carried on repairing a chair leg at the table, his focus calm and steady. The scrape of sandpaper filled the room. Helen watched him, grateful for that quiet competence. It reminded her that storms outside did not have to reach inside. Few days later a letter arrived. The handwriting was Lily's, brisk, looping, confident. Helen slit it open and read aloud. I've been thinking you should come visit for Christmas. You and James both if you're still in touch. I know you'll say it's too far, but I'd love that. Spain's not the same without home. Love, Lily. Helen folded the paper slowly. She thinks we should come for Christmas, she said. James looked up from the chair. Would you want that? I don't know. He nodded. Then we'll decide later. His use of we made her throat tighten. She had not realized until that moment how much she had begun to include him in every small plan. How quickly two solitudes could knit into a shared pattern. That afternoon they walked to the post office in the village to fetch supplies. The street smelled of wet wool and bread from the bakery. People nodded politely, but Helen felt eyes linger too long. Outside the shop, Mrs. Fenton was talking to the grocer. Her voice carried easily. They say he's family, but I've seen how they walk together. Helen froze. James touched her arm lightly. Ignore it, he murmured. She forced a smile for the grocer, paid for the milk, and walked away with her head high. Only when they reached the lane again did her shoulders slump. I hate that small minds can make something ugly out of kindness, she said. James kicked a stone along the road. People see what they want. Let them. It's not that easy. He stopped, turning to face her. Then what do you want me to do? Leave so they stop talking? The question hung between them like cold mist. Helen shook her head. No. I want you to stay because you want to, not because you think you should protect me. I do want to, he said quietly. But I also don't want to make your life harder. You already make it better. The words came out sharper than she intended, full of truth she hadn't planned to show. For a moment neither moved. Then Helen walked ahead, heart pounding. That evening, James packed a small bag and placed it by the door. Helen found him there. What's this? I'll go into town for a few days, he said. Let the gossip cool down. You need peace. And what will they say when they see you leaving at dusk with a suitcase? He hesitated. She stepped closer, voice low. If you leave now, it looks like we have something to hide. He exhaled. Maybe we do. Even if it's only friendship the world doesn't understand. Helen studied his face. The mix of stubbornness and care. Then let's not explain ourselves. Let the world tire of watching. He smiled faintly. You've always been braver than you think. And you, she said, more patient than I deserve. They left the suitcase by the door but never opened it again. 2 nights later the wind changed again. The sky cleared, a spill of cold stars over the hills. Helen and James took their mugs of tea outside, breath steaming in the air. It's strange, she said, how the quiet feels different now. Not lonely. He nodded. Maybe quiet isn't the absence of people. Maybe it's when you're finally understood. Helen looked at him, surprised by how simple and true it sounded. From somewhere down the lane came the faint crunch of tires. The postal van, running late. A letter dropped through the gate a few minutes later. Helen opened it by lantern light. Change of plans. I might visit for a weekend before Christmas. Miss you. Love. Lily. Helen met James's eyes. Both smiled, but there was a flicker of alarm beneath it. She'll see how it is, James said. And how is it? Helen asked softly. He hesitated. Peaceful. Honest. I hope she sees that. Helen folded the letter. Then that's what we'll give her, honesty and peace. They stood for a while in the chill, the garden rustling around them. For the first time since Mrs. Fenton's visit, Helen felt no fear of the dark. She felt the strength of the earth under her feet, the certainty of truth that did not need defense. Inside, she placed Lily's letter beside the one from before. The 2 envelopes touched, edges aligned like sentences that finally made sense. James, she said quietly, whatever happens when she comes, thank you. For what? For reminding me that quiet lives can still change. He smiled. Maybe that's all we ever do. Change each other a little. The clock ticked on. Outside, the wind dropped, and the house seemed to settle around them, holding their fragile calm like a secret it intended to keep. The train from London reached the village in the middle of a thin November rain. Helen watched the taxi turn down the lane, tires hissing over the puddles, until it stopped in front of the gate. A moment later Lily stepped out, wrapped in a long red coat, hair wind-tossed, eyes bright from travel. "Mom," she called. Helen met her halfway down the path, laughing as they hugged. The familiar scent of her daughter's shampoo and city perfume mixed with the cold air. For a heartbeat Helen forgot the weeks of worry. "You look wonderful," she said. "So do you." Lily pulled back, glancing at the house. "It hasn't changed at all." "And James?" He had appeared in the doorway, a towel over his shoulder, still dusty from fixing the stove. He smiled a little shyly. "Welcome home, stranger." Lily ran up and hugged him too. "It's so good to see you both in one place. I've missed this." For the rest of the afternoon, the cottage filled with voices again. James carried her bags upstairs, Helen brewed tea, and soon the three of them sat at the kitchen table as if nothing had ever been strained. But underneath the chatter ran a quiet current. Small pauses, glances quickly averted. Lily noticed it, of course. She always did. That evening after dinner, she walked out onto the porch. James was stacking firewood near the shed. "You've done a lot here," she said. "The place looks different." "Just maintenance," he replied. "Your mum keeps it running. I just help." Lily studied him. "You've been here a while." He nodded. "Couple of months. Must be nice. Away from the city." "It is." His voice was steady, but she heard the weight behind it. "I'm glad," she said softly. She needed company. "She's stronger than she thinks," he answered. Lily smiled faintly. "So are you." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees. Something in the stillness felt fragile, like a thread pulled too tight. Inside, Helen was washing dishes when Lily came back. "You never told me James was staying this long," Lily said gently. Helen dried her hands. "It just happened. He needed time away. I needed help with the house." "I can see that." Lily hesitated, choosing her words. "It feels different here, that's all. Quieter but heavier somehow." Helen looked out the window. The reflection showed two faces, hers and her daughter's, one older, one searching. "Sometimes peace looks heavier when you're not used to it," she said. Lily tilted her head. "Are you happy, Mum?" The question caught Helen off guard. She turned, meeting her daughter's gaze. "Yes," she said after a moment. "For the first time in a long while, yes." Lily nodded slowly. "Good." And with that she smiled, as if she had just released a breath she didn't know she was holding. The next morning brought pale sunlight and the smell of coffee. James was already outside repairing the fence again. Lily joined him, holding 2 mugs. "Mum said you were a city man before all this," she teased. "I still am. I just forgot how to stop moving." She handed him the second mug. "You helped her stop too, I think." He looked down at the steaming cup, unsure how to answer. "She's been alone a long time," Lily continued. "When Dad died, she tried to fill every hour with work. I worried she'd disappear into that house." James's voice was quiet. "She saved me more than I saved her." Lily smiled. "Then maybe you both did each other a favor." Helen stepped out a moment later, a basket of laundry in her arms, catching the tail of their laughter. "What's so funny?" "James says he's turning into a gardener," Lily said. Helen laughed. "Then I'll have to keep him here until spring." For a second their eyes met, mother and son-in-law, a silent acknowledgement of everything that could not be said, everything already understood. That night they sat by the fire, the three of them, telling stories from years ago. Lily talked about her new job, the beach in Valencia, the stray cat she'd adopted. Helen listened, smiling, while James added small comments that drew easy laughter. When Lily went up to bed, the house grew quiet again. Helen gathered the cups, set them in the sink, and lingered there. "She's happy," James said from the doorway. "She is." She didn't ask questions. Helen turned, half smiling. She didn't need to. The fire crackled softly. Outside, rain began again, tapping against the glass. "Tomorrow," Helen said, "let's take her to the lake. It's where she always felt free." James nodded. "I'd like that." The next day the sky cleared enough for a walk. The three of them followed the old path, the same one Helen and James had taken months before. Lily ran ahead, calling over her shoulder. "It's smaller than I remember." Helen laughed. "You've grown." At the water's edge, Lily turned, her cheeks flushed. "I used to think the world ended here," she said. "Now it feels like it begins here instead." Helen looked at her daughter, confident, open, alive, and felt something inside her settle. Maybe this was how circles closed. Not with regret, but with continuity. James skipped a stone across the lake. It leapt 4 times before sinking. Lily clapped. "You still have it." He smiled. "Some things stay." Helen stood beside them, watching the ripples fade. The moment held all the words they didn't need to speak. Forgiveness, gratitude, quiet love in its purest form. That evening, as Lily packed to leave the next day, she hugged her mother tightly. "You're lighter," she whispered. Helen smiled. "Maybe I finally remembered how to breathe." Lily turned to James. "Take care of her, will you?" "I will," he said. When the taxi disappeared down the lane the next morning, the house felt full rather than empty. Helen and James stood together at the gate, the wind carrying the scent of damp earth and lavender from the garden they had planted. "She knows," Helen said at last. James nodded. "And she's at peace with it." "So am I." They walked back toward the cottage, side by side, the light stretching long across the fields. For the first time, the silence between them felt simple. No secret, no fear, only the gentle rhythm of 2 lives that had learned how to stay kind in a world that misunderstood kindness. Winter passed slowly but kindly. Frost drew thin silver lines across the windows each morning, and the garden slept under a pale sky. Helen spent the coldest weeks reading by the fire, while James worked on small repairs around the cottage, a hinge here, a bit of paint there, both of them finding rhythm in ordinary days. Letters from Lily arrived every fortnight, full of warmth and busy city stories. She asked often if they were both keeping well, and Helen's replies were always simple. "Yes. The house feels alive again." By March, snowdrops pushed through the thawed earth, and the air began to smell of wet soil and green beginnings. James said he would leave soon, go back to the city to look for steady work. Helen agreed that it made sense. Still, something in her chest tightened at the thought of the door closing behind him. "I'll visit," he said when he saw her expression. "You'll hardly notice I'm gone." "I always notice," she replied, but with a smile. He looked at her then, long enough for understanding to pass without words. There were no promises, only quiet truth, the kind that stays even when people part. One morning in early April, Helen woke to the sound of birds. The air through the open window was soft, carrying the scent of damp leaves. She went outside barefoot, feeling the chill of the ground. The garden was alive again. Daffodils opening, bees hovering uncertainly, the first real warmth of the year. James was in the shed, sorting tools for the last time. "You'll miss your train if you start another project," she teased. He laughed. "Just trying to leave things in order." "You already did." He set down the hammer, wiping his hands on a cloth. "I don't know how to thank you, Helen. For all of it." She shook her head. "You don't owe me thanks. You just reminded me what it feels like to live." They stood there, surrounded by the smell of cut wood and morning light. For a moment, Helen thought of how it had begun. The awkward visits, the grief they both carried, the long days of silence and work. She realized then that healing hadn't arrived all at once. It had crept in quietly, disguised as routine. When James left that afternoon, he carried only a small bag. Helen walked him to the gate. "Take care," she said. "You too. And write if you ever get tired of the quiet." She smiled. "The quiet doesn't tire me anymore." He nodded, then turned down the lane. She watched until he disappeared behind the hedgerows, a figure moving toward whatever came next. Days passed. The cottage felt larger but not lonely. Helen filled it with new sounds, a radio playing softly, the clink of dishes, her own humming. She joined a small art group in the village, started painting the hills she saw every morning. Sometimes, when the light slanted just right, she thought she could still hear James's laughter in the garden. Not as a ghost, but as a presence folded into the place, like sunlight caught in old glass. Mrs. Fenton still passed by occasionally, curious as ever, but her glances no longer mattered. Helen had learned that peace doesn't depend on what others believe. It's a choice, quiet, firm, and private. In June, a letter arrived with a Spanish stamp. I've been offered a new position. Small art studio by the sea. You'd love it. Come visit when you can. Bring James if you still see him. Think he'd like it too. Love, Lily. Helen smiled at the invitation, then set the letter on the mantel. Bring James if you still see him. Later that week, she walked to the lake alone. The water was still, reflecting the sky perfectly. A heron stood on the far bank, poised and silent. Helen sat on the same rock she had shared with James months ago. I do still see you, she murmured, not to the air, but to the memory of a friendship that had remade them both. She closed her eyes, letting the sun warm her face. By late summer, a postcard arrived from London. The city's noisy, but I'm managing. Started at a small design firm. The garden will be waiting, won't it? J. Helen read it twice, then tucked it beside Lily's letter. The corners of both cards touched, like pages in a story that hadn't quite ended. That evening, she went outside to water the flowers. The sky was orange, the same shade as the poppies by the fence. The garden buzzed softly with life. She thought of how much had changed, and how much hadn't. Loss, gossip, silence, renewal. All of it had folded into something steady and real. Helen set down the watering can and looked toward the lane, the same path that had carried so many departures and returns. Somewhere beyond it, life continued. Cities, trains, letters, new beginnings. Here at the cottage, everything was simple. The rhythm of seasons, the quiet promise of another day. And in that stillness she smiled. Not waiting, not wishing, but simply content. Because sometimes, hope doesn't arrive like thunder. Sometimes it just stays. A year later, the cottage looked almost the same. Ivy curling up the stone walls, lavender spilling over the path, the paint on the gate slightly faded by another English summer. Helen stood in the doorway one morning, holding a cup of tea, listening to the sound of the garden waking. Bees moved lazily among the flowers, and a blackbird sang from the roof. It had been a year since that long, strange summer when her world quietly rearranged itself. A year since James had walked down the lane with his bag, since Lily's red coat had vanished into the rain, since Helen had learned that healing can arrive disguised as ordinary days. She smiled at the thought. The ache of those months had turned into something soft, a memory with edges worn smooth. James came back in spring. Not to stay, not to resume anything that required explanation, but simply to visit. He had written first, as he always did. The city's all noise. I miss the stillness of your mornings. May I come for a weekend? And of course she had said yes. When he arrived, the rhythm between them returned easily, like a song remembered after silence. They talked about work, about the garden, about Lily's art studio by the sea. There was no tension, no pretense, only quiet understanding. On the second evening they walked to the lake again. The water shimmered gold in the setting sun. You kept it beautiful, he said. It kept itself, she answered. I just stopped trying to control everything. He smiled. You sound happier. I am. They didn't say much else. When they parted the next morning, it wasn't sad, just peaceful, like two chapters that had finally found their proper endings. Helen began teaching a small painting class in the village that summer. At first, only 3 people came. An elderly man who'd never painted before, a shy teenager, and Mrs. Fenton herself. When Mrs. Fenton arrived on the first day, awkward and uncertain. Helen simply smiled. "We all start somewhere," she said. By the end of the session, they were laughing over crooked trees and lopsided skies. Something in the air between them shifted. Not friendship exactly, but forgiveness. Helen realized then that life didn't erase the past. It softened it, like sunlight fading the colors on old paper until what was harsh became gentle again. That autumn, Lily came home for a week. Her hair was shorter, her hands streaked with paint. "Mum," she said one evening, "James visited me in London." Helen looked up from her cup of tea. "Oh. He said you were doing well." "I am," Helen said. Lily nodded, smiling. "I can see that. I think he needed to see it too." They spent the next morning painting together in the garden, 2 easels side by side, their brushes tapping softly. At one point Lily said, "Do you ever miss it, that summer?" Helen thought for a while before answering. "I don't miss the pain of it. But I'm grateful for what it taught me. Which is that love isn't always about keeping someone. Sometimes it's just about becoming braver together, and then letting the world move on." Lily smiled faintly, as if she understood. The days shortened again. By December, frost glazed the windows and the sky turned pale gray. Helen decorated the house with pine branches and ribbons. She baked, she painted, she laughed more easily than before. On Christmas morning, 2 envelopes waited by the door, one from Lily, one from James. "Merry Christmas from the coast," Lily wrote. "I'm happy, Mum. I think you'd love the light here. Feels like your garden." "Merry Christmas, Helen," James's card said simply. "The city's quieter this year. Hope the lake still remembers us." Helen placed both cards on the mantel, side by side. The fire crackled softly. She sat by the window, looking out at the white garden, and felt a calm that reached all the way through her. Outside, the world glittered with frost. Inside, warmth and memory intertwined, not as sorrow, but as proof of how far she had come. Helen smiled, lifting her tea to the light. "The lake remembers," she whispered. "And so do I." And with that, she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet fill her. Not empty anymore, but full of everything that had ever mattered. The kind of quiet that stays.